The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, and by Friday, Theodora Langley was on a westbound train with everything she owned packed into 2 leather trunks and a hatbox that had seen better days. She had read the telegram so many times in those intervening days that the paper had softened along its creases, the ink slightly smudged where her thumb had pressed against the words again and again. It was not a long message. Gideon Covington was not, by all accounts from his letters, a man who wasted words. The telegram had said simply, "Come when you are ready. The house is waiting. I am waiting." And then his name, signed in a hand that was surprisingly careful for a man who spent his days breaking horses and mending fences in the Wyoming Territory. Theodora had been corresponding with Gideon for 7 months before she agreed to come. She was 24 years old and had spent those years in St. Louis, Missouri, working as a seamstress in her aunt's dress shop on Market Street. It was respectable work, quiet work, and it had kept her fed and clothed since her parents died of fever when she was 19. But quiet work did not fill the particular hollow in her chest that had been growing steadily wider with each passing year. She wanted a life that felt like something. She wanted open sky and purpose and someone to build toward. Her friend Clara, who had married a rancher from Colorado through a correspondence arrangement the previous spring, had been the one to suggest it. Clara said the agency in Kansas City was reputable and that the men who wrote through them were genuine. Theodora had been skeptical, but she had written anyway, and Gideon Covington had written back. His first letter had been practical to the point of being almost amusing. He told her the facts of his situation in plain language. He was 28 years old. He had built the Covington Ranch in Sweetwater County, Wyoming, over 6 years of hard work, starting with 160 acres he had claimed under the Homestead Act of 1876 and gradually expanding through purchase to nearly 400 acres. He ran cattle. He had 3 hired hands who were good workers and decent men. The land was beautiful if you appreciated open country and big skies and winters that would test your constitution. He needed a wife because ranching was not something a man could sustain alone, not if he wanted it to grow, and he did want it to grow. He said he was not looking for a housekeeper. He was looking for a partner. Theodora had written back and told him she was not looking for a rescue. She was looking for an equal footing. He had written back and said that sounded exactly right to him. Over the following months they had exchanged letters that began formally and gradually became something warmer. He told her about the land, about the way the morning light came over the Wind River Range and turned everything briefly gold before settling into the long blue clarity of a Wyoming day. She told him about the dress shop, about the particular satisfaction of getting a seam perfect, about the way her aunt had taught her that taking care with small things was a form of love. He told her about a horse he was training, a gray mare with a bad temper, and an intelligence that made the bad temper almost forgivable. She told him she thought she would like the gray mare. He wrote back and said he thought so too. By the time she boarded the train in St. Louis on that Friday morning in late April of 1882, she felt that she knew Gideon Covington in some essential way, even though she had never laid eyes on him. She also understood rationally that letters could not tell you everything about a person. She held both of those truths in her mind as the locomotive pulled out of the station and the city began to fall away behind her. The journey took 3 days. She changed trains in Kansas City and again in Cheyenne, where she spent a night at a boarding house run by a stout woman named Mrs. Haverson, who fed her salt pork and biscuits and told her with great authority that Wyoming was no place for a woman who bruised easily, by which she seemed to mean both physically and emotionally. Theodora thanked her for the advice and the biscuits, both of which were delivered with equal force. From Cheyenne, she took the last leg of the journey north and west, watching the landscape change through the smudged window of the rail car. The flat grasslands of eastern Wyoming gave way to rolling prairie, and then the land began to lift and break, and the mountains appeared in the distance, still carrying their winter snow along the peaks even in late April. She had never seen mountains before. They made her feel something she did not quite have a word for, something between humility and exhilaration. She arrived at the small depot town of Rawlins on a Wednesday afternoon. Gideon's letter had said he would send someone to meet her if he could not come himself, since the ranch was a 2-hour ride from town, and his hands might be needed during spring calving. She stepped off the train onto the platform with her 2 trunks and her hat box, and looked around at the raw, busy little town. It was 1882, and Rawlins was still young, its streets unpaved, its buildings a mix of solid timber structures and things that looked as though they had been assembled in a hurry and might reassemble themselves into something else if the wind got ambitious enough. She waited on the platform for 20 minutes, watching the other passengers disperse, watching the station agent argue with a freight handler about a consignment of lumber. The afternoon sun was warm and direct and smelled like dust and something that might have been sage. She was just beginning to consider her options when a young man of about 20 with a battered hat and an open, sunburned face came jogging up to the platform looking slightly out of breath. "Miss Langley," he said, already pulling his hat off in a gesture of courtesy so automatic it seemed like breathing to him. "I am sorry for keeping you. I am Clem Rafferty. I work for Mr. Covington. The wagon is just around the front of the station." His name was Clement Rafferty, and she would come to know him well in the weeks ahead. He was 20 years old, the youngest of Gideon's 3 hired hands, and he possessed the particular combination of earnestness and good humor that made him immediately likable. He loaded her trunks into the back of a sturdy wagon with a cheerfulness that suggested he did not find any task beneath him, and then he helped her up onto the bench seat with a courtesy that she suspected he had been specifically instructed to show. They set out from Rawlins on a road that grew less defined the farther west they traveled, until it was more of a tracked suggestion across the landscape than an actual road. The country was enormous and empty in a way that was different from anything Theodora had experienced. In Missouri, emptiness was temporary, something between towns and farms, a held breath before the next human presence. Here, the emptiness was the thing itself. The land stretched in every direction to the horizon with a grandeur that was almost aggressive, as though it were daring you to call yourself significant. Clem talked a fair amount on the journey, which she appreciated. He told her about the ranch, about the spring calving that was nearly finished now, about the gray mare that Mr. Covington was still working with. He said the other 2 hands were brothers named Josiah and Walter Prout, both originally from Tennessee, and that they were good men if a little quiet. He said the ranch house was solid, built from timber that Mr. Covington had cut and hauled himself, with a proper kitchen and 2 rooms upstairs that he had just finished adding on in preparation for her arrival. She listened and watched the landscape and felt something that was part excitement and part nerves, and part of very pure, clean anticipation. They were still about 20 minutes from the ranch when Clem went quiet. He had been talking fairly steadily for the better part of an hour, so his silence registered immediately. Theodora noticed it and looked at him. His face, which had been easy and open, had done something complicated. He was looking ahead and to the left, toward the western sky, and the expression on his face was one that she recognized even though she had never seen it directed at something quite like this. She followed his gaze. The sky to the west was wrong. It was the color it should not be, a deep copper orange that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun, which was still high and to the south. And beneath that wrong color, there was a darkness that rose in a column and spread at the top like a terrible flower. She understood what it was even before she fully understood what it meant to her specifically. "That is the ranch," Clem said, and his voice was barely there. She did not say anything. She felt the realization arrive in her body before she could frame it in language, a cold falling sensation in her chest that had nothing to do with the warmth of the afternoon. That fire was at the place she was traveling toward. That fire was at the place that had been described to her in letters over 7 months as home. That fire was at the place where Gideon Covington was waiting. Clem snapped the reins without another word, and the horses broke into a faster pace. The last 20 minutes of that drive were the longest of Theodora Langley's life. She held the side of the wagon seat with one hand and kept her eyes on that terrible smoke and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would help anything. She was running through what she knew and what she did not know. She did not know how it had started. She did not know how long ago it had started. She did not know whether everyone was safe. She did not know where Gideon was. When they came over the last low rise and the ranch came into view below them, she saw it all at once. The main house was gone. She could see the shape of where it had been, the foundation stone still standing, the chimney still upright in a way that seemed almost defiant, but everything that had been built on top of those stones was black and broken and still breathing smoke. The barn was partially standing. The north wall and part of the roof collapsed inward, the south wall somehow still upright. Two of the smaller outbuildings were still intact. The corral fencing had survived, and she could see the horses in the far corral moving uneasily, unsettled by the smell and the memory of the fire. And then she saw the figure standing in what had been the yard in front of the house. He was standing at the edge of the ash and debris, not moving. His hat was in his hand. He was looking at the ruins of the house with an expression she could not yet read from this distance, but the stillness of him was something she felt in her own body. He was not a small man. Even from here, 200 yards away, she could see the breadth of his shoulders and the way he stood, feet apart, weight balanced, a man who was built for bearing weight. Clem brought the wagon down the slope and into the yard and stopped about 30 feet from the standing man. The man turned at the sound of the wheels. This was Gideon Covington. He was 28 years old, which she had known, but she had not been able to picture him clearly from his letters, had not known what shape to give to the voice she had come to know on paper. He was tall, with dark hair that wanted cutting, and a face that had been made by outdoor work into something that was more weathered than young, though not old either. Just formed. His eyes, she would notice, were the particular deep brown of river water over stones. He had ash on his shirt and on the backs of his hands, and there was a smear of it across his left cheek. He looked at this moment like a man who had been through something that had stripped everything down to the essential, and what remained was a person who was entirely present in this moment and not doing anything at all to protect himself from the reality of it. He looked at her. She looked at him. The wagon had stopped between them and the ruined house, and the smoke was still rising in the afternoon air. She climbed down from the wagon herself before Clem could come around to help her, a decision she made without thinking about it, and she walked toward Gideon and stopped a few feet away. She could smell the ash on him. She could see that his jaw was tight and that he was working against something, some large feeling that he was containing through sheer effort. "Miss Langley," he said, and his voice was lower than she had imagined it, and it cracked very slightly on her name. "It appears there has been a complication," she said, because she could not think of anything else to say, and she watched something happen in his face at her words, something that was not quite a smile but was not entirely unlike one. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "There has." He looked back at the ruined house for a moment, and she stood beside him and looked at it too. The chimney was the tallest thing left standing. The kitchen wall had fallen outward, and she could see the iron stove sitting in the debris, dented and blackened but somehow still there. The 2 rooms upstairs that he had built for her arrival were entirely gone. "How did it start?" she asked. "We do not know for certain," he said. "I was out on the North Range most of the morning with Josiah. Walter was in the barn. Clem had gone to town to meet you. Best we can work out, it started in the kitchen, maybe a coal from the stove catching on the floor. By the time Walter saw the smoke, it was already in the walls." "Is everyone safe?" she asked. That was the thing that mattered most, and she should have asked it first. "Everyone is safe," he said. "Walter burned his hands some getting the horses out of the barn before the fire jumped. Not bad, he will be fine," she exhaled. "Good," she said, "good." A long silence settled over them both. The smoke continued to rise. The horses in the corral moved and stamped. "I am sorry," he said then quietly. "You came all this way. I promised you a house." Theodora looked at him. She looked at the ash, and the still-standing chimney, and the broken barn wall, and the two intact outbuildings. She looked at the land around the ranch, the wide grass country stretching away in every direction, the mountains holding their snow on the horizon, the enormous Wyoming sky going blue and infinite overhead. "The land is still here," she said. He looked at her with an expression that she would think about for a long time afterward. "Yes," he said, "it is." "And you?" she asked. "I am here," he said. "Then nothing that matters is gone," she said. The silence after that was different from the silence before it. It had weight and texture and something living in it. Gideon looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at the ruins of the house, and then he looked back at her. He stood up a little straighter. She could see him making some kind of interior decision, could see it in the set of his shoulders and the change in his eyes. "I will build it again," he said, not as a reassurance and not as a promise made to her specifically, though it was both of those things. He said it the way a man states a fact about himself, the way a man says something he knows with certainty, the way he knows the location of his own hands. Something in Theodora's chest that had been tight since she saw the smoke on the horizon loosened. It did not untighten all at once. It was a gradual release, like the tension going out of a rope when the load it is bearing is finally set down safely. "I know you will," she said. Those words, she would later understand, were the first real exchange of trust between them. Everything before had been words on paper. This was two people standing in an ash yard in the Wyoming Territory in the spring of 1882, looking at what remained after a catastrophe and deciding together how to stand. They were not married yet. That was one of the many practical problems that the next several days would surface. The wedding had been planned for Saturday, 4 days from now, at the small church in Rawlins. The pastor, a grave man named Reverend Aldous Finch, had been informed. A small gathering of neighbors had been invited. Theodora's aunt had sent a length of ivory silk fabric with her, packed carefully at the bottom of the larger trunk, which had survived the journey in good condition. None of that plan had changed, as it turned out. What had changed was everything surrounding it. With the house gone, the question of where Theodora would sleep for the next 4 nights required immediate practical solution. Gideon gave her the decision without ceremony. He said there was his bunk in the foreman's quarters behind the barn, which was one of the intact outbuildings, or he could set up a proper sleeping area in the grain storage building, which was dry and solid, or Clem could ride back to town, and she could stay at the boarding house until Saturday. He presented these options with a directness that she appreciated, and then he stood back and let her choose. She chose the grain storage building, and she said she would need some help making it presentable. And within 2 hours Josiah and Walter Prout had cleared half of it and set up a cot with clean blankets and hung a piece of canvas across the middle for privacy. And Walter had fashioned a small washstand from a barrel and a plank of wood, doing all of it with his burned hands wrapped in clean cloth and never once complaining. She thanked him, and he ducked his head and said it was no trouble, ma'am, in a voice that was so thick with genuine Southern courtesy that she almost wanted to laugh. That first evening, they all ate together around a fire in the yard. Josiah cooked salt pork and beans and cornbread in a Dutch oven, and the 5 of them sat in the warm spring darkness with the smell of smoke still heavy in the air, and the stars beginning to appear overhead in the quantity she had never seen from a city. So many stars it seemed almost excessive, almost like a show-off gesture from the universe. Gideon sat across the fire from her, and she watched him in the firelight. He was quiet but not withdrawn, and she noticed how his men looked at him, with the particular ease that people have around someone they trust without reservation. He talked with Josiah about what lumber would be needed, about what could be salvaged from the ruins, about whether there was any chance the root cellar under the house had protected any of the preserved food stocks. He talked with Walter about his hands and told him plainly that he was not to do anything with them until they had properly healed. And Walter said yes, sir, in the tone of a man who respected the instruction, even if he intended to ignore it after 24 hours, which was about how long it turned out to be. After the others had drifted off to their respective sleeping places, Gideon and Theodora sat on opposite sides of the dying fire for a while in a silence that was not uncomfortable. "I have been trying to think," he said at last, "about whether I should apologize more than I have, or whether more apologizing would not actually help anything." "It would not help anything," she said. "You did not set the fire." "No," he said, "but I feel that I have failed to deliver on what I offered." "You offered a partnership in building something," she said. "As I understand it, we are now building it from a slightly earlier start than either of us expected. I do not see how the essential offer has changed." He looked at her across the dead embers of the fire. The night was cool and the stars were extravagant overhead. "You are not what I expected," he said. "You wrote very honest letters," she said. "I assumed you meant what you said in them." "I did," he said. "Then I assumed you wanted someone who also meant what she said." "I did," he said again, and there was something in his voice that had nothing to do with the practical arrangements of ranch life. She went to bed that night in the grain storage building under the Wyoming stars and lay for a long time listening to the sounds of the night, the horses shifting in the corral, an owl somewhere in the darkness, the faint creak of the barn's surviving wall in the small night wind. She thought about Gideon's face in the firelight. She thought about the ash on his shirt and the steadiness of his voice when he said he would build it again. She thought about the fact that she was sleeping in a grain storage building in the Wyoming Territory with a man she had never met before that afternoon, and she was going to marry him in 4 days, and she felt, to her own considerable surprise, entirely unfrightened. She felt, in fact, something that would take her another week to name correctly. What she felt was interested. Not the polite social interest of a woman making the best of a situation, but the genuine, wide-awake interest of a person who has arrived somewhere new and found it worth being fully present for. The next morning she woke before sunrise and came out of the grain building to find Gideon already in the yard, already looking at the ruins of the house. The early light was coming from the east, and the ruins were dark against the light, and he was standing with a cup of coffee, which he had clearly made on the campfire from the night before, and he was not standing with defeat in his posture. He was standing the way an architect stands in front of an empty lot. He heard her coming and turned, and she saw something cross his face before his expression settled into a greeting. "There is coffee," he said. She poured herself a cup from the battered pot and came and stood beside him. They looked at the ruins together. In the morning light she could see things she had not been able to see the evening before. The foundation stones were solid and good. The chimney was entirely intact. The root cellar door at the side of the house was closed and showed no fire damage, and when Gideon went and opened it, they found that a good portion of the preserved food stores had survived. "Root cellar held," he said, and there was quiet satisfaction in his voice. "The foundation is good," she said. "Solid," he agreed. "I poured those footings myself, 2 feet deep all the way around." "So you are building on what is already there," she said. He looked at her. "That is exactly what I am doing," he said. That morning, while Gideon and his men began the work of clearing the debris, which was 2 days of work at least, Theodora did a practical inventory. She walked the entire property with a notebook she had in her travel bag, which she had purchased at the beginning of the journey because she had thought she might want to write down impressions of her first days, and she began making a list of what was intact and what was needed. She cataloged the contents of the root cellar, the state of the grain storage, the condition of the barn, the fencing, the water trough, the condition of the horses. She noted the tools that had been stored in the forge building which had not caught fire and the state of the tack room. When she brought the notebook to Gideon in the afternoon, he stood and read it in silence for several minutes. Then he looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between disbelief and something warmer. "You did all this morning," he said. "I needed to be useful," she said. "This is going to save me 2 days of figuring," he said. "Then we can start building sooner," she said. He smiled at her then for the first time, a full, unguarded smile that did something interesting to his face, made it younger and more open, and she felt the effect of it in a way she was not entirely prepared for. She looked back at her notebook and found a smudge on one of the pages that suddenly required her attention. They rode to Rawlins together the next day, which was Thursday, to speak with Reverend Finch about the wedding and to purchase lumber and supplies. Gideon drove the wagon and she sat beside him on the bench, and the road was long enough that they talked for much of it, the conversation ranging over topics both practical and personal in a way that felt natural rather than performed. She asked him about how he had come to Wyoming in the first place. He told her that he had grown up in Kansas, the youngest of 4 children on a farm that never quite made enough, and that when he was 21, he had decided that he wanted land of his own, land that was fully his from the foundation up, and that the Wyoming Territory was where a man could still claim that. He had come with almost nothing, and he had worked for 2 years on other men's ranches before he filed his homestead claim. He said those 2 years had taught him more than he could say about what he wanted and did not want. She told him about her parents, about the fever that had taken them in the winter of 1877, about the years in the dress shop. She told him about the particular loneliness of building a respectable life that fit perfectly well but did not feel like it was quite hers. Like wearing a coat that is the right size but belongs to someone else, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said, that is exactly right. In Rawlins, they spoke with Reverend Finch, who was a lean, serious man with kind eyes, and confirmed that the wedding would proceed on Saturday as planned. He nodded at the news of the fire with the gravity of a man who had seen the frontier exact its unpredictable tolls before, and he said that the Lord was not averse to new beginnings, and that starting a marriage on rebuilt ground was perhaps not the worst omen one could find. It was the most pastoral he apparently got, because after that he was entirely practical about the schedule and the arrangements. They spent the rest of the day at the lumber yard and the general store, where Gideon negotiated for a load of timber to be delivered within the week, and Theodora made purchases for the kitchen that would be needed before there was a kitchen to put them in. She bought a Dutch oven of her own, and flour and salt and coffee and dried beans, and a length of cotton fabric for curtains that did not yet have windows to hang in. The man at the general store, whose name was Hardin and who seemed to regard Gideon with real respect, shook his hand warmly and said he was sorry to hear about the fire and that the whole county would help if they needed it. "You will not be doing this alone, Covington," Hardin said. "You want me to put the word out?" Gideon looked at Theodora briefly, some instinct causing him to check with her before answering, a small gesture she noticed and would remember. She gave a very slight nod. "I would be grateful for that," Gideon said. What she did not know then, and would understand better over the following days, was the particular texture of community that existed in that part of Wyoming. It was a sparse community, ranches spread across enormous distances, but precisely because of that sparseness, it had developed an ethic of mutual aid that was almost tribal in its necessity. When your nearest neighbor was 4 miles away, and winter could kill you and a fire could take everything in an afternoon, the only insurance that actually worked was the willingness to show up for one another. By Saturday morning, the day of the wedding, 3 neighboring ranchers had already sent men over to help with the clearing. The Dunmore family from 6 miles north sent 2 of their hands. Old Septimus Clay, who ranched alone on the east side of the river and was by repute not especially social, showed up himself with a wagon full of salvageable timber he had apparently been storing since his own barn rebuilt the previous year, and he said nothing when he arrived beyond asking where he should put it, and nothing further when he left at sundown, but he came back on Sunday too. The wedding itself was simple and short and honest, which was the only kind of wedding it could have been under the circumstances, and which turned out to be the exact right kind. They drove to Rawlins in the wagon that Clem had cleaned and polished with a dedication that was almost heartbreaking. Theodora wore a dress that her aunt had sent, not the ivory silk, which she had decided to save for a different occasion, but a deep blue wool challis with white collar and cuffs that she had made herself the previous winter, and that fit her exactly because she had cut every seam herself. Gideon wore a clean white shirt and a black wool coat that she suspected was the best thing he owned and which fit him well enough. He had shaved carefully, and his dark hair was combed back, and she thought, standing beside him in front of Reverend Finch in that small church with the light coming through two small windows, that he was a good-looking man in the way that honest, useful things are good-looking, not decorative but solid and well-made. The ceremony was attended by Clem, Josiah, and Walter, the last of whom insisted on coming despite his bandaged hands, and sat in the front pew with the careful stillness of a man trying not to let his discomfort show. The Dunmore family had sent word they would come, but one of their mares was foaling, and they sent their apologies and a jar of honey and a smoked ham, which Clem brought back to the ranch with the gravity of a man carrying valuable cargo. Reverend Finch read the vows in his careful voice, and they said them back to him. When Gideon took her hand to put the ring on it, she felt the roughness of his fingers, the calluses along the palm, and she thought that here was a man whose hands told the whole story of how he had built what he was standing in the middle of, and she found that she was glad for those hands, glad for what they testified to. He looked at her face when she looked up from her hand, and his eyes had that quality she had noticed in the firelight, the quality of being entirely present, entirely there, not managing a distance between himself and the moment. "I do," he said, and it was not loud, but it was absolute. Afterward they all ate the smoked ham and cornbread that Josiah had made on the campfire, sitting in the yard of the ranch under the late April sky, and Clem made a speech that was rambling and sweet, and ended with him looking at his boots with embarrassment and everyone laughing. Walter raised a tin cup and said simply that he was glad of it, and Josiah said, "Hear, hear," and Gideon looked across the makeshift table at Theodora, and she looked back at him, and the moment was private even with everyone around them. That night was cool and clear, and they slept on opposite sides of a canvas partition in the grain storage building, which was the most practical and least romantic wedding night imaginable, and which somehow, in the honest absurdity of it, was exactly right for two people who had agreed from the beginning that they were building something together rather than inhabiting something finished. She lay in the dark and listened to his quiet breathing on the other side of the canvas, and thought about his hands and his eyes, and the way he had looked at the ruined house that first afternoon, not broken by it, not performing strength either, just standing with it as a fact and deciding what came next. She thought she might be in the early stages of something she had not expected to arrive quite so quickly. The lumber arrived on Monday, and the building began in earnest. The neighbors who had come to help with the clearing stayed for the framing, and additional people arrived over the following week in the particular way of that kind of community, word having spread through whatever system of information traveled between remote ranches in 1882. Which was a combination of passing riders and ranch hands going to town, and the informal network of people who watched out for one another's welfare. The Dunmore family came on Wednesday, all four of the adult Dunmores, Harrison and his wife Bet and their two grown sons, and Bet Dunmore was a stout, direct woman of about 50 who took one look at Theodora and decided something on the spot, and thereafter treated her as if they had been friends for years, which was the most effortlessly comforting thing that happened in that first week. Bet brought food, enormous quantities of it in a manner that suggested she considered feeding people one of the primary moral obligations of human existence. She brought bread and pie and a crock of butter and a side of cured bacon, and she supervised the distribution of all of it with cheerful authority while also somehow managing to help haul timber planks. She was entirely formidable in the best possible way. "You will be all right," Bet told Theodora on that first Wednesday, not as a consolation but as an assessment, the way a practical person states an observed fact. You have good sense about you, and he is a solid man. You will be all right." "Thank you," Theodora said. "Do not thank me," Bet said. "I have been watching that man try to run this ranch alone for 3 years, and I have been telling Harrison since last summer that what he needed was a woman with her feet on the ground. Harrison said it was not my business. I said everything in 40 miles is my business. Harrison is still wrong about that." Theodora laughed, genuinely, for the first time since arriving at the ruined ranch, and Bet nodded with satisfaction as though she had diagnosed and treated something. The work of rebuilding was absorbing and physical and constant. Theodora found her place in it naturally. She was not a woman who needed to be told how to be useful. She could cook over an open fire and in the Dutch oven as well as anyone, and she fed the work parties with a consistency and quality that Clem said was better than anything he had eaten since his mother's kitchen in Ohio, which was the highest compliment in his vocabulary. She took over the supply management from the notebooks she had already made, keeping track of lumber and nails and provisions with a precision that meant nothing was wasted and nothing ran short. She learned to identify the species of wood being used and understand why Gideon was choosing what he was choosing, and she asked questions that were genuine rather than decorative, questions about load-bearing and insulation, and the way a chimney needed to be drafted, and he answered them with a directness that acknowledged she actually wanted to know. In the evenings, after the work crews had gone and his men had turned in, Gideon and Theodora sat by the fire and planned. They talked about the house, about what rooms it would have and how they would be arranged, about the kitchen layout and the windows. They talked about the ranch and its growth, about the cattle operation and the possibility of expanding the horse operation, since the gray mare that he was training was proving to be exceptional, and there might be a market for well-trained horses in the territory. She had ideas about the garden and the root cellar expansion. He had ideas about a second barn and a bunkhouse that was properly insulated for the Wyoming winters. These were conversations about the future, about a shared vision of what they were building toward, and in the course of them something happened between them that was less dramatic than what she might once have imagined love arriving would look like, but was more solid, more real, more deeply rooted. She fell in love with him the way the land accumulated depth, layer by layer over time, the layers invisible individually but cumulative and foundational in their effect. The first layer might have been the moment she watched him help old Septimus Clay's arthritic hands with a particularly stubborn joint in the timber frame, doing it without drawing attention to it, just quietly positioning his own hands alongside the older man's and bearing the load without making it a rescue. The second layer might have been the evening she found him sitting with his notebook making a list of what they needed and found her name in the margin, not written in any sentimental way, just written there, Theodora, as though he had been thinking of her while he was thinking about lumber, and had written her name the way you write a thing you want to remember is important. Or it might have been the morning she woke with a headache that she tried to ignore, and he noticed at breakfast, and without making a fuss mixed her a cup of willow bark tea that he had apparently known to have on hand because the bark was in his kit box, and said nothing about it except that she should sit down for 20 minutes, which she did. Or it might have been the evening he took her to see the gray mare, who was no longer quite as bad-tempered as she had been, apparently, though still possessed of strong opinions about the world. He brought Theodora to the edge of the corral and let her stand there, and the gray mare came over with her particular intelligent wariness and sniffed Theodora's hand for a long moment. "She likes you," Gideon said. "She is evaluating me," Theodora said. "She likes you," he said again, with a certainty that suggested he knew the horse well enough to distinguish between evaluation and approval, and that the two were not mutually exclusive. Perhaps it was all of those things, accumulated, deposited, becoming something she lived within before she had fully named it. She believed he was falling in love with her too, though he was a man who held his feelings carefully, not because he was cold, but because he seemed to understand that feelings that are held carefully last longer than feelings that are spilled immediately. She saw it in the way he oriented toward her in a group, not obviously, not clinging, but with a consistency that was more telling than any performance. She saw it in the way he listened to her, with the quality of attention that is the most honest form of regard, the kind that says your words are worth the full weight of my consideration. She saw it most clearly one evening when Clem, in the course of a conversation around the fire, made an offhand remark about how different things would be if Miss Langley had turned around when she saw the fire, and Gideon went very still in a way that had nothing to do with offense at Clem, and everything to do with the fact that the idea of her having turned around was apparently one he found genuinely terrible to contemplate. He recovered quickly and said something mild, and the conversation moved on, but she had seen his face in the moment before recovery, and she filed it away. 2 weeks after the fire, the framing for the new house was fully complete. It was a Thursday evening when they walked through the framing together for the first time, moving through the skeleton of what would become their home, the upright posts and horizontal beams making a grid of space that was currently open to the evening sky but would be enclosed within another week if the weather held. He had made it larger than the original house. The kitchen was deeper and had a proper pantry space. The main room was wider. Upstairs, instead of 2 small rooms, there were 3, one of which he said without explanation was intended for children. And she said nothing at that, and neither did he, but the air between them acquired a particular quality that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. She stopped in the center of what would be the main room and looked up through the open framing at the sky, the deep blue of a Wyoming evening going toward dark, with the first stars beginning to show. "It is going to be bigger than the first one," she said. "Better built too," he said. "I know more than I did 6 years ago." "It is good to learn things," she said. He was standing about 4 feet away from her in the skeleton of the house, and the evening light was doing something particular to the planes of his face, and she was suddenly and completely aware of him in a way that had been building for 2 weeks and was now simply present, undeniable, a warm pressure in her chest that she recognized clearly. He was looking at her too. "Theodora," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded different than it had ever sounded when anyone else said it, more serious, like the name of something that mattered. "Yes," she said, though he had not asked a question. He crossed the 4 feet between them in 2 steps, and he put his hand against her face with a gentleness that was at odds with the roughness of his palm, and she put her own hand over his hand, and they stood like that in the framing of their house under the Wyoming sky, and she felt that she had arrived somewhere completely, not just geographically, but in some deeper and more essential sense, the way you arrive at a thing you have been moving toward without knowing it. He kissed her carefully, the way he did everything, with attention and without waste, and she kissed him back, and the evening around them was enormous and quiet and full of the smell of new timber and sage. "I have been trying not to rush this," he said against her hair afterward. "I know this is a strange way to begin." "I do not think it is strange," she said. "I think it is very much like us." He pulled back enough to look at her face. "Is it?" he asked. "We are 2 people who decided to build something," she said. "And then something happened that required us to build it from the foundations, and we are doing that. I do not think that is strange at all. I think it is who we are." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her, and then he said, "I am glad you did not turn around." "I thought about it for half a second," she admitted. "What changed your mind?" he asked. "You were standing in the ash," she said, "and you were not defeated by it. I wanted to know a person who could stand in the ash of a thing they had built and say they would build it again and mean it absolutely." He was quiet again in that way of his that was not blankness but fullness, as though he was taking something in completely before responding. "I meant it absolutely," he said. "I know," she said. "That was the point." The house roof went on in early May, during a stretch of warm, dry weather that Gideon said was not to be trusted, but that held long enough for them to get the shingles laid and the chimney remortared. The neighbors came for the roof raising in the tradition of the territory, a full day of communal labor that also functioned as a celebration. And Bet Dunmore brought enough food to feed a small army and organized the women who came with their husbands with the calm competence of a general. Theodora found herself in the middle of something that felt genuinely like community, which she had not experienced since her parents were alive, had not experienced perhaps ever in this particular way. This web of mutual obligation and shared investment that made the vast empty land feel inhabited in a way that maps could not convey. She talked with Bet about gardens and preserving, and the particular challenges of Wyoming winters. She talked with a woman named Ruth Alvarado, whose husband ran the smallest of the neighboring operations and who had come west from Texas 6 years earlier, about making a home in country that was bigger than any home could contain. Ruth was quiet and practical, and had the steady quality of someone who had made peace with the essential uncertainty of frontier life, without being indifferent to its difficulties, and Theodora felt an immediate kinship with her. She talked with Harrison Dunmore about cattle, and Harrison, who was initially politely surprised to be having this conversation with a woman, quickly shifted gears when he realized she was asking intelligent questions about the market and the drives, and gave her his honest views with the respect that practical intelligence always eventually compels. She noticed Gideon watching her from across the work site with that quiet, assessful look of his, the look that meant he was taking something in, and she raised an eyebrow at him, and he gave her a small, private smile that she kept for herself. The house was livable by the middle of May. Not finished, not furnished, not quite what it would eventually become, but livable, solid, real. The floors were swept clean wood, and the chimney drew properly, and the windows had the curtains she had bought the fabric for before the house that would hold them existed. The kitchen had the iron stove from the ruins of the old house, which Josiah had cleaned and restored to full function with a mechanical patience that she found genuinely impressive, and it stood in the new kitchen like a survivor that had earned its place. The evening they slept in the house for the first time properly, with walls and a roof and windows and a door that latched, Gideon stood in the middle of the main room and put his hand flat against the wall, feeling the solidity of it, and she watched him do that and understood completely what he was feeling. "Solid?" she asked. "Solid," he said. She came and put her hand against the wall beside his. The wood was smooth under her palm, new cut and clean. "Better than the first one," she said. "Every version is better than the last," he said, and she was not certain he was entirely talking about the house. The summer of 1882 was the fullest that Theodora Langley, who had become Theodora Covington on a Saturday in late April, had ever lived through. It was full in the way that working land is full, every day occupied with something real and necessary. The garden that she planted in the cleared ground south of the house, the chickens she acquired through a trade with Ruth Alvarado that began with 5 hens and expanded with their characteristic chicken logic over the summer. The cattle operation that was Gideon's primary work. The gray mare, whose name turned out to be Agnes, which Gideon said he had given her as a joke, and which had stuck because it suited her personality, who was ready by July for the trail rides that would show what she was capable of. There were also, woven through the work of that summer, the smaller and more private things that constituted the fabric of becoming a married couple, of learning the actual texture of another person's daily existence rather than the version that exists in letters. She learned that he woke before dawn without an alarm, that he was a quiet starter in the mornings and needed coffee before he was fully present, that he read in the evenings when there was enough light, that he had opinions about books that he had apparently kept entirely to himself, until she demonstrated that she had opinions too and was willing to argue them. He owned 3 books, which had been among his few personal possessions stored in the forge building and thus survived the fire. One was a Bible that had belonged to his mother. One was a copy of Herman Melville's work that he had acquired in a trading post years ago and reread periodically. One was a practical volume on cattle ranching that he referred to as the manual, with an affection that suggested he trusted it less than he would admit. She had brought books in her trunks, several of them. He regarded her book collection with the pleased expression of a man who has discovered unexpected abundance in a place he already thought was good. They read to each other sometimes in the evenings, which she had not anticipated doing, and which turned out to be one of the quiet habits of their shared life that she would later count among the most precious. She would read to him, and he would sit across the room or sometimes beside her and listen with the same quality of attention he gave everything. And sometimes he would say something about what she had read that was so precisely observed she would have to stop and think about it for a while. He learned, over that summer, a set of things about her that she had not explicitly told him. That she was happiest when she was doing something with her hands, that idle time made her anxious, that she was braver than she looked when something actually frightened her, that she cried sometimes at things she considered stupid to cry at and refused to apologize for it, that she had a particular way of thinking through problems that involved walking around them from multiple angles before coming to a conclusion, which made her quiet sometimes in a way that could seem like distance but was actually the opposite, that she loved the Wyoming sky in a way that was not merely appreciation but something more visceral, something that made her stand outside in the evening sometimes just to look at it. He told her, one evening in late July when the sky was doing something extraordinary, the sun gone below the horizon and the whole western arc of sky going through a progression of colors from deep orange to rose to violet that seemed to take its time about it, that the sky had been the first thing about Wyoming that he had loved, before the land, before the work, before anything else. I came over a rise my second week here, he said, and the sky was doing something like this, and I thought, all right, I will stay. She looked at the sky and then at him. That is a very rational reason to stay somewhere, she said. I am a very rational person, he said. You are, she said. Except that you named a difficult horse Agnes. That is entirely rational, he said. She has an Agnes quality. I think you love that horse. I respect that horse, he said with great dignity. Gideon. I may also love that horse, he conceded. She laughed and he smiled, and the sky continued its exhibition overhead. There was one difficult thing that summer which had to be addressed directly, and which she addressed directly because that was who she was. About 2 months after her arrival, during a trip to Rawlins for supplies, she overheard a conversation between two men outside the general store. They were talking about the Covington ranch, and the tone was dismissive in a way that was specifically about her, about a woman being involved in the decisions of a cattle operation, about whether Covington had lost his sense by marrying some city woman who thought she could play at ranching. The language was not kind, and the implication was that her presence was something between an eccentricity and a liability. She did not confront the men. She was not a person who believed that every ignorance deserved a direct response. But she told Gideon about it that evening matter-of-factly because she believed he needed to know what was being said, and because she wanted to know his response before she had a fully formed response of her own. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was genuinely thinking rather than managing his reaction. "Does it concern you?" he asked, not defensively, but actually wanting to know. "It concerns me in that I want to understand if it affects the operation," she said. "Whether it makes our neighbors less willing to do business with us or creates problems we need to account for." "It will not," he said with a certainty that came from knowing his neighbors. "The men whose opinions actually matter around here judge by what a person does and what they produce. You have been here 2 months and you have kept this operation running more efficiently than it ran before. The people I respect can see that. And the people whose opinions do not matter," she asked. "They will come around when they see it continued," he said. "And if they do not, their opinions will remain as valuable as they are now, which is not very." She nodded. Then she said, I want to be clear that I am not here as an ornament or a helpmate in the purely domestic sense. I intend to be fully involved in the decisions of this ranch." "I know that," he said. "I have always known that. It is part of what I wanted. I want it to be visible," she said. "Not for my ego, for what we are building. I want it understood that this is a partnership in the full sense." "It is understood by me," he said. "The rest will follow." And it did follow gradually through the plain arithmetic of competent and visible work. She was at the fall livestock assessment alongside Gideon, asking questions and taking notes. She was present when they sold the cattle to the drive buyer in September, and she had done her research on the market prices beforehand, and Gideon listened to her read out her findings before the buyer arrived. And the price they got was better than the previous year. She was there when the neighboring ranchers came to discuss the communal fencing dispute that was an ongoing concern in that area, and she had relevant things to say. And after the first few minutes of polite surprise, the conversation proceeded as though she had always been in it, which was all she had wanted. Bet Dunmore, who observed all of this with great satisfaction, said to her in October, "You know Harrison was right about one thing. This is your business, not his, not mine. But I am glad of it." "Thank you, Bet," she said. "Do not thank me," Bet said. "I just call what I see." The fall was the season that consolidated what had been built over the summer, both the physical ranch and the marriage. The house acquired the texture of a lived-in place. The kitchen shelves filled with Theodora's preserves, row on row of sealed jars that represented the summer's garden and also something more, some form of stored security, of preparation against winter's inevitable demands. The bunkhouse, which had been finished in August to Josiah's considerable relief, since he and Walter and Clem had been sleeping in progressively crowded conditions in the old foreman's quarters, was properly insulated and comfortable. Agnes the gray mare had been sold to the Territorial Army for a price that made Gideon blink and then look at Theodora with an expression she could only describe as delighted. "We should get more horses like her," she said. "I have been thinking that for 3 years," he said. "I have not had the capital to focus on it." "You have it now," she said. "Agnes has made her argument in favor of the horse operation." He pulled out his planning notebook, and she sat beside him and they talked about it for an hour, the breeding program and the training approach, and the kind of market they were aiming for. She contributed ideas about record-keeping and the practical tracking of bloodlines, and he contributed the deep knowledge of horses. That was one of the things he was most genuinely expert in. By the time the evening fire had burned down to embers, they had a rough plan that felt solid and real. She realized, looking at him across the table strewn with papers and notes, that she was happier in this moment than she could remember being in an adult life that had had genuine good things in it. It was a specific happiness, dense and grounded, the happiness of being fully deployed in something that mattered with a person you trusted completely. She said it simply, "I am very happy." He looked up from the papers and looked at her face for a moment with that quality of full attention. "So am I," he said, and then, because he was Gideon Covington and precision mattered to him, he added, "More than I expected, more than I thought I had the capacity for." That November she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning over coffee because she had decided that good news should be delivered in the plain light of day rather than dressed up in ceremony. She stated it clearly and watched his face. He put his coffee cup down with extreme care, the way you handle something precious after being startled. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the information traveling through him, could see it arrive somewhere deep and essential. "Theodora," he said. "Yes," she said. He stood up and crossed to where she was sitting, and he crouched down in front of her chair and took both her hands and held them, and he looked at her face with an expression that contained so many things she stopped trying to catalog them and just looked back at him. "Are you well?" he asked. It was the first thing he thought to ask, which told her something. "I am well," she said. "Tired sometimes, but well." He raised her hands and pressed them against his face and closed his eyes for a moment, and she could feel the warmth of his cheek against her knuckles. Then he opened his eyes and looked at her. "I built that room," he said. "The room upstairs." "I know you did," she said. "I did not know then," he said, "if it would ever be used for what I built it for. I did not know how things would go between us. I just thought, build the room anyway." "Build the room anyway," she said. "That is a very good philosophy." He stood and pulled her up with him and held her, not dramatically, just held her in the quiet kitchen with the morning light coming through the windows and the smell of coffee in the air and the big Wyoming sky visible through the east window beginning its day. "I did not expect this," he said into her hair. "Any of this. The fire destroyed things, and then somehow this year I ended up with more than I had before." "We built better," she said. "You said every version is better than the last." "I did say that," he agreed. Winter came down hard in December, as Wyoming winters were known to do, and the ranch closed in around itself in the way that frontier homesteads did when the first serious snows came, becoming a self-contained world with its own rhythms and requirements. The horses needed regular attention. The cattle needed feed supplemented. The snow needed to be cleared from the bunkhouse roof, and the barn roof with a regularity that Josiah appeared to regard as a personal affront from the universe. Inside the new house, Theodora found the winter different from what she had expected. She had imagined isolation and had prepared for it, had stocked books and her sewing supplies and the practical projects that would fill the indoor hours. What she found was that the isolation was not empty but dense, a concentrated form of the life they had been building, stripped of outside distraction, and made entirely interior in a way that was its own kind of richness. She and Gideon played cards in the evenings and argued amiably about books, and she taught him a card game her father had taught her that involved a degree of strategic deception that she was considerably better at than he was, which he found alternately amusing and maddening. He told her stories about his early years in the territory that he had apparently been storing up for a time when there was enough quiet to tell them in, stories about the winters he had spent alone in a one-room cabin, about the things he had learned about himself in that solitude, about what he had wanted that the solitude had clarified. "I thought I was a person who needed less than most people," he told her one February evening. "I thought I had organized my life correctly. Just the work and the land and the animals. And," she said, "and I was wrong about the less," he said. "I was not a person who needed less. I was a person who had not yet found what I needed." She looked at him across the firelight. The house held the warmth of the fire and the cold was outside against the windows, and she was large with the child now, 6 months along, and she felt the aliveness of everything with a physical fullness that she suspected was partly the pregnancy and partly something more general, some quality of this life and this marriage. "I am glad you wrote that first letter," she said. "The practical one, about the homestead and the cattle." "I debated over that letter for a long time," he said. "I did not know how much practicality was appropriate." "It was exactly the right amount," she said. "I had received letters from 2 other men through that agency. One wrote entirely about his feelings and his hopes, which I respected but which told me nothing. The other wrote about his property as though he were writing an advertisement. What did you think of my letter?" "I thought, this man is honest about what he has and honest about what he wants, and he is not performing anything," she said. "That was all I needed to know to write back." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought about your first response for a long time," he said. "You said you were not looking for a rescue. I thought about whether I had implied in my letter that I was offering one." "You had not," she said, "but I wanted to be clear." "You were clear," he said, with the small private smile she had come to know and love especially. "You have always been very clear." "I find it saves time," she said. "The baby was born on the last day of March, 1883, and he was a boy. Gideon was with her through the whole of it, which was not the standard arrangement in those years, when men were generally expected to wait outside and be informed of outcomes afterward. But Gideon was not a man who believed in that particular tradition, and Theodora had not expected him to be. Bet Dunmore came as the experienced hand, having delivered several of her grandchildren in addition to her own 2 sons, and she ran the proceedings with her characteristic competent authority, and Gideon was there at Theodora's side being exactly what she needed, which was present and steady and not requiring management. The boy was healthy and loud, and immediately had opinions about the world, which seemed perfectly appropriate given the specific combination of characters that had produced him. They named him Samuel, after Gideon's father, who had died the year before Gideon came to Wyoming. They lay together in the new room of the new house, the room that had been built in anticipation without certainty of its purpose, and they had Samuel between them, small and new, and the morning was coming through the east window with the particular delicacy of early spring light. "Samuel," Gideon said quietly, testing the name against the reality of the actual person. "He has your jaw," Theodora said. "He has your eyes," Gideon said. "Poor child," she said. "Those are excellent eyes," he said, and the firmness with which he said it made her feel something that was better than any compliment she could put a word to. Bet Dunmore, before she left that afternoon, stood at the door of the room and looked at the three of them for a moment and said, "I have seen a great many beginnings and a great many endings in this country. This is one of the good ones." And then she was gone, her horse's hoofbeats retreating into the spring afternoon. The spring and summer of 1883 were different from the previous year in the way that things are different when they are consolidated rather than built. The ranch was now fully operational, the horse breeding program beginning to produce results, the cattle operation stable and growing, the garden expanded and better organized than the first summer because she knew the soil now and the seasons and what thrived. Samuel grew with the extravagant speed of healthy babies and was carried by turns by everyone on the ranch, Clem especially, who had appointed himself unofficial godfather without anyone's explicit sanction, but with everyone's implicit approval, and who could be found on any given afternoon holding the boy up to see the horses and explaining them in comprehensive detail to an audience who could not yet speak but who appeared, to Clem's satisfaction, to be paying close attention. There was one afternoon in late summer that she would keep for the rest of her life, for the way it contained everything. Gideon had come in from the North Range early because the work was done, and the day was too fine to squander on invented tasks, which was one of the things she had learned about him, this occasional willingness to simply stop and be present in a good moment rather than filling it. Samuel was asleep in the house. The afternoon was warm, and the sky was doing its usual extraordinary work overhead. They walked together to the small rise north of the house from which you could see the whole ranch laid out below, the house and the barn and the bunkhouse and the corrals, everything they had built and rebuilt, and beyond them the land stretching away to the mountains that still held a remnant of their winter snow along the very highest ridges even in August. "1 year ago I arrived and the house was ash," she said. 1 year and 4 months, he said. He knew the precise count. She was not surprised. "And now look at it," she said. He looked at the ranch for a moment, and then he looked at her, and she saw in his face the thing she always saw in his face when he looked at her, which was the specific expression of a man looking at the most important thing in his field of vision, not possessively but with a quality of regard that was profound and real. "I would not have believed it," he said. "If someone had told me that morning, standing in that yard with the house still smoking, that in 1 year I would be standing here looking at this, I would not have thought it possible." "You said you would build it again," she reminded him. "I meant the house," he said. "And what did you get?" she asked. He looked at the ranch, at everything below them, and then he looked at her again. "Everything," he said. "I got everything." She took his hand, the rough-palmed, calloused, working hand that she had come to know as well as she knew her own, and they stood on the rise above the ranch in the August afternoon with the mountains watching from the distance and the sky performing its endless, generous exhibition overhead. "We got everything," she said. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth against her knuckles, and she leaned against him, and the afternoon held them both in its warmth. And she thought about the telegram on its worn creases and the train leaving St. Louis and the smoke on the horizon, and the man standing in the ash who had looked at the ruin of a thing he had built and decided without hesitation that he would build it again. And she thought that she had never in her life been more precisely where she was supposed to be. That was not the end of the story, of course. It was more like the point at which the foundations were fully set and everything above them could be relied upon. In the winter of 1883, they expanded the horse breeding program, purchasing 2 mares from a ranch in Colorado that had the bloodlines Gideon had been watching for. And by the following spring, the program had 3 foals on the ground that were already showing the quality he had identified in Agnes and had been working toward ever since. The Territorial Army contract that Agnes had opened was now a regular arrangement, and Gideon's reputation for well-trained horses spread through the region with the efficiency that good reputations travel in small communities. Samuel took his first steps in December, to the enormous satisfaction of the entire ranch population and especially Clem, who had apparently been coaching him in private on the grounds that a head start was a fair advantage in life. He was a sturdy, curious child who had inherited his mother's habit of thorough investigation and his father's careful patience, which was a combination that did not make for an easy toddler but made for a very interesting one. In the spring of 1884, they took on 2 additional hired hands, brothers named Felix and Dominic Reyes, who were from a ranching family originally from New Mexico and who were excellent hands and honest men. Josiah and Walter Prout stayed on, and the ranch's complement grew to a full working crew that functioned with the smooth efficiency of people who respected each other's competence. Theodora managed the payroll and the supply accounts, and was treated by the crew with the plain respect that competence eventually compels everywhere, regardless of what prejudices might have preceded it. Ruth Alvarado came to visit in April, and they spent an afternoon in the kitchen talking, while Samuel played on the floor with a collection of wooden horses that Gideon had carved over the winter with a skill that had surprised her, and that he had apparently been embarrassed to mention he possessed, as though woodcarving were something that needed an apology attached to it. "You are well established," Ruth said, looking around the kitchen with its full shelves and its order. "We are," Theodora said. "The territory needs more of this," Ruth said. "People who actually stay and build rather than extracting and moving on." She thought about that afterward, about what it meant to be part of a place rather than a resident of it, about the difference between using a landscape and belonging to it. She had come from a city, and she had been afraid, in her most honest moments that first year, that she might always be a transplant, always overlaid on a place she had not grown into. What she found instead was that belonging was not a quality you possessed at birth, but one you accumulated through care and time and investment, through the work of seasons, through the children born into a specific soil and sky, through the neighbors whose difficulties had become your difficulties, and whose celebrations had become your celebrations. She belonged to Wyoming. She had come to understand this without announcement, the way you come to understand that you have passed from one country into another without having crossed a visible line. In the summer of 1884, she discovered she was expecting again, and this time she told Gideon in the evening rather than the morning, over supper, and he received it with the same particular quality of stillness he had shown the first time. And then he looked at Samuel, who was currently attempting to feed a piece of cornbread to one of the dogs with a generosity that exceeded the available supply, and he looked at her and he said, "The room upstairs could hold 2. "It could hold 3 if we are practical about it," she said. He laughed, which was still one of her favorite sounds, and reached across the table and took her hand. This child was a girl, born in January of 1885, in the middle of a snowstorm that confined everyone to the ranch for 4 days, and gave the entire crew an intensity of investment in the proceedings that Bet Dunmore, who had made the journey in the teeth of the weather with Harrison's considerable anxiety, expressed audibly the entire way, said she had never quite experienced before. The girl was born healthy and vocal, in the way of all the Covington children apparently, and she was named Clara, after the friend in Colorado who had first told Theodora about the agency in Kansas City. "She will appreciate the compliment," Clem said solemnly, holding Clara with the experienced confidence of a man who had been operating as unofficial godfather for 2 years. "She will not know about it for some time," Theodora pointed out. "Then she will appreciate it retroactively," Clem said. "That is also valid." The years settled into the rhythm of a built life, which was not static or finished but accumulative, adding layers and depth while keeping the essential structure intact. Samuel grew into a boy who loved horses above all other things, and followed his father around the ranch with a devotion that was mutual and unspoken. Clara grew into a girl who had her mother's precise practical intelligence and her father's stillness, a combination that produced a child of unusual and occasionally alarming capability, who was found on one occasion at age 3, attempting to reorganize the contents of the root cellar according to a system she had apparently developed independently. Gideon built a proper addition to the barn in 1886, doubling its capacity, and added a covered training arena for the horses that Theodora had proposed the previous winter on the grounds that Wyoming winters reduced the training season unacceptably. He had looked at her sketch of what she envisioned and said, characteristically, that it would work and that they should build it wider than her sketch showed. And she said all right, and the arena went up in the spring and was immediately worth every board that had gone into it. There was a difficult season in the winter of 1886 and 1887, which was known across the entire territory as the Great Die-Up, a catastrophic combination of drought and extreme cold that devastated cattle operations across Wyoming and Montana. The Covington Ranch was not spared, losing a significant portion of its cattle herd over the course of that terrible winter. It was a blow, and Theodora and Gideon faced it squarely and together, sitting at the kitchen table in the long cold evenings and working through the numbers and the options with the same practical directness they brought to everything. "We are not going to lose the ranch," Gideon said one evening, and it was not bluster. It was the same quality of statement as when he had stood in the ash of the burned house and said he would build it again. The calm certainty of a man who knows his own capacity. "No," she agreed. "We are not." The horse operation saved them in the end. While the cattle losses were real and painful, the horse breeding program had been growing for 3 years and had established the ranch's reputation for quality animals well enough that buyers came to them rather than the other way around. They reduced the cattle operation by 2/3 and redirected the resources and attention into horses. And within 2 years, the ranch was not only stable, but in some ways stronger, having been forced into a shift that the disaster had clarified was the right direction. It was not something she would have chosen. It was not something anyone would have chosen. But she had by then enough experience of difficult things to understand that some of the best versions of a life are built on the ruins of plans that did not survive contact with reality. She thought about that often, about the thesis their life had demonstrated from its very first afternoon. In the summer of 1888, they went to St. Louis, just the two of them, leaving Samuel and Clara with Bet Dunmore, who received them as though they were a gift rather than an imposition, and who sent Theodora away with instructions not to worry, stated in the tone of someone who knew perfectly well the advice would not be entirely followed, but considered it important to give anyway. Theodora had not been back to St. Louis since she had left in the spring of 1882, 6 years. Her aunt, Margaret Langley, who had never quite forgiven her niece for leaving the dress shop to go west, had aged in those 6 years into a smaller and somehow more honest version of herself, the armor of propriety slightly reduced by time, and she received Gideon with a formality that softened over the course of the first dinner into something that, while it would never be quite warmth, was at least genuine respect. St. Louis was different than she had left it, larger and louder and more modern, with electric lights beginning to appear in the better establishments, and the streets busier than she remembered. She found that she looked at it as a visitor now, affectionately but without the feeling of belonging that had once been her only life. She had been afraid, setting out on the journey, that returning might stir some longing for what she had left. What she found instead was that she was simply glad to see it the way you are glad to see a place that made you who you are, with gratitude for its past contribution and no desire to return to it. Gideon in a city was something she had not seen before, and she watched him with great interest. He was not uncomfortable exactly, but he was clearly more comfortable with different scales of thing. He moved through the crowded streets with patience and without complaint, but she could see him registering the density of human presence the way a person registers a particularly loud noise, not painfully, but with a constant awareness of it. On their last evening in St. Louis, they sat on the balcony of the hotel overlooking the city, and she watched the lights and he watched her. "Well," he said. "I am ready to go home," she said. "Good," he said. "You have been ready since approximately the second day," she said. "The first, actually," he said with perfect honesty. She laughed and he took her hand, and the city made its city sounds below them, and she thought about the train she would board in the morning heading west, heading back to the big sky and the mountains and the children and the horses and the ranch she had arrived at as a stranger and left on fire and come back to and built and rebuilt and loved. They came home to Sweetwater County in early August to find that Clem Rafferty, who was now 26 and had been quietly courting the schoolteacher in Rawlins for the better part of a year, had used the 2 weeks of their absence to make himself more than useful around the ranch, and also to apparently finalize the proposal that had been in preparation for some time. He told them the evening of their return with the expression of a man announcing something of great moment and considerable personal satisfaction. Gideon shook his hand and said he was glad of it, and that the schoolteacher, whose name was Caroline and who had visited the ranch twice, was a fine woman and Clem was a lucky man. Theodora hugged him and said she wanted to be invited to the wedding, and Clem said, "Of course you are invited. You are basically my family," in a voice that cracked slightly and then recovered with dignity. Samuel, who was 5 now and had been waiting at the fence for their return with the focused intensity of a child who has been counting minutes, launched himself at Theodora when she came down from the wagon, and she caught him and held him and smelled his hair, and said she had missed him terribly, which was entirely true. Clara, who was 3 and possessed of the self-possession of someone much older, waited for her turn with a patience that was entirely characteristic, and then accepted being held with great dignity. Gideon crouched down and pulled both children against him at once, and stayed there for a moment with his eyes closed, and she watched him and felt the fullness of this particular moment, the kind of moment that does not announce itself as significant but is the actual material of a life worth living. They had supper that evening on the porch, which had been added to the house the previous summer, a wide covered porch on the south side that caught the afternoon shade, and after the children were in bed they sat in the late evening air and the western sky was doing its performance, the colors cycling through their range above the mountains. "Gideon," she said. He said, which was his response when he was looking at something. "I have been thinking about the third room upstairs," she said. He turned and looked at her, and after a moment he smiled, the full, unguarded smile that still did what it had always done to her. "Have you?" he said. "Practically speaking," she said. "Of course," he said, "practically speaking. The room is there," she said. "You built it in anticipation." "I did," he said. "It seems a shame to waste it," she said. He reached over and took her hand in the evening air, the rough, familiar warmth of it, and they sat together on the porch in the dusk, with the sky going down in splendor over the mountains, and the ranch spread out before them in the last of the light. The barn and the arena and the corrals and the horses and the garden and the bunkhouse with its warm lamp in the window, all of it built and rebuilt and built better, all of it theirs and together. The boy who arrived the following spring completed the upstairs rooms of the house, all three of them full now, just as Gideon had built them in anticipation of exactly this, without knowing when or how, or with whom it would happen. They named him Edward, and he was from his very first days a laughing child, which neither of his siblings had been in quite the same way, and he was passed from person to person on the ranch like a piece of particularly valuable sunshine. Even Josiah Pruitt, who had never been known for expressiveness, making faces at him in the kitchen with a commitment that was complete and apparently unembarrassing. Clem and his wife Caroline came to see the new baby 3 weeks after he was born, and Clem held the baby and looked at Theodora over the baby's head with an expression that was the purest form of happiness, the kind that is entirely on behalf of someone else. "You came a long way from St. Louis," he said. "I came a long way from St. Louis," she agreed. "It was worth the trip," he said. "It was worth every mile," she said. That was the summer of 1889, and the Wyoming Territory became the state of Wyoming the following year, in July of 1890, the 44th state in the Union, notable among other things for being the first to grant women the right to vote, a fact that had been true of the territory since 1869, and that Theodora had registered with great personal satisfaction when she first learned of it, and that she exercised every opportunity to exercise. She voted with Gideon beside her, both of them in their best clothes on a Tuesday morning, walking into the polling place in Rawlins with Samuel at 8 years old between them, old enough to understand the significance of the occasion in a general way, if not yet all its specific historical weight. She would make sure he understood it fully in time. That was one of the things that fell under her particular jurisdiction, the education of her children in the actual complexity of the world they lived in, its injustices and its possibilities, and the long, unfinished work of making it more just than it had been. She thought about that sometimes, about the ways the world was still being built, about the same principle that had applied to the ranch applying everywhere. You could stand in the ash of things that had not been right and decide to build again and build better, and the building was never finished, but the work of it was the most human thing there was. The ranch was prospering in 1890, the horse operation now the primary business and well regarded through a wide region. The cattle herd rebuilt at a scale that fit the changed operation rather than the original ambition. The whole thing a different shape than what Gideon had imagined when he first filed his homestead claim, but a better shape. The shape of something that had been tested and had held, and had been refined by what it had survived. On the morning of their 8th anniversary, which was in late April and which fell on a Saturday in 1890, she woke early and came downstairs to find Gideon already in the kitchen making coffee. He heard her on the stairs and turned, and the morning light was coming through the east window, and he was standing in his own kitchen in his own house, the house he had built for the second time on the foundation of the first, and she stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment before he could arrange his face into anything careful. What she saw on his face before he arranged it was pure, unguarded contentment, the expression of a man who is exactly where he wants to be, doing exactly what he wants to be doing, in the company he most wants. "Anniversary," she said. "I know," he said. He poured her coffee and put it on the table in the way she liked it, with the cup on the right side of the table and the chair pulled out slightly so she did not have to reach, and she sat down and he sat across from her in the morning light, and the house was quiet with the sleeping quiet of 3 children upstairs. "8 years," she said. "8 years," he said. "What do you have to say about it?" she asked. He looked at her across the kitchen table, in the house he had built on the foundations of the house that had burned, on the land he had claimed and expanded and fought for and kept, and he said what he always said when she asked him what he thought, which was the thing that she had trusted from the very beginning, which was the precise truth as he understood it. "I would not change one day of it," he said. "Not one." She looked at him and thought about the telegram and the train and the smoke on the horizon and the man in the ash. She thought about everything that had been built and burned and built again. She thought about Samuel and Clara and Edward asleep upstairs, and the horses in the corral and the mountain standing their patient vigil on the horizon, and the Wyoming sky beginning its daily extravagance outside the kitchen window. "Neither would I," she said. And outside the window the sky went on, enormous and brilliant and entirely unconcerned with the smallness of individual lives, except that it was not, in fact, unconcerned. It was the sky under which all of this had happened, the same sky that had looked down on the ash and on the rebuilding and on the years of accumulation, and it was there now, present and continuous, the way the things that matter most are always present and continuous, not dramatic but enduring, the way a foundation holds not by announcing itself, but by simply being there, solid beneath everything built upon it, bearing all of it without complaint, built to last.